I think Michael and I have had to get used to living in a small town. There's really no anonymity, is there? No. Everybody knows everything about everybody, right? You know, we used to have strangers stopping us in the middle of the store to ask us how we liked living in the Means house. We didn't know these people. It was kind of weird at first. I mean, stranger knowing that we were people living there is just kind of baffling. But now we think it's really fun. It's a great conversation starter to get to know new people, and we're having a great time with it. And we're really settling in here. And when my family and I moved to Lufkin in the 80s, in the late 80s, it was a pretty small town there too. I don't even think we had one chain restaurant when we moved there. There was like half a mall. So it was kind of small townish too. And I remember starting school, just going into junior high, and everybody wanted to tell me everything about everybody. You know, they just thought I should know X, Y, and Z. I remember meeting a girl named Alice in the choir, and I really liked her. She was a neat girl. And we became friends, and she was very well liked. So I felt special that she would pay attention to me as a new girl. But then one day, some girls that were kind of popular, the cookie girls, they came up to me and they just wanted to let me know a little something about Alice. And they proceeded to tell me a very tragic story about her father passing away recently. And, you know, they just thought I should know about that. And I'm not getting into the details of what happened to him, but let's just say that he was suffering from depression, and he never found help. And he ultimately gave up on life. And they were traumatized by that great loss. She never really talked to me about it until we were well into high school, but I could tell that she was treated differently by us, you know, especially once we knew what was happening, and everybody knew what happened. So her and her family were kind of in a bubble, and you just never forgot what she went through. I still remember every time I would drive by her home to pick up my sister from the junior high later, it's all I thought about. Because she still lived in the house where her father passed away. And it's all I thought about. We all knew her life story. We all knew every single detail. There's no anonymity in a small town, especially when it comes to difficult stories. And yet, somehow, we all knew everything about her, and yet Alice had lost her identity. Instead of just being Alice, she had become the girl whose dad died in that house. She became unnamed. But her name was Alice. You know, in this morning's text, in the Gospel of John, we had another unnamed woman who also has a very difficult story to tell. And I bet you every single person in that village in Samaria knew that woman's name. Don't you think? Everybody knew who she was. Our first clue for this is that she's drawing water at the well at noon. It says noon. See, Bible scholars tell us nobody would have done that. Nobody would have been carrying huge jugs up to a well. They had to carry it on their heads at noontime. It was the hottest, most blistering part of the day. Maybe she was drawing water at the well at noon because nobody else would be there. Maybe she didn't have to face anybody at noontime. Maybe she wasn't allowed to go at any other time. I don't know. Second, we're told that she has had 5 husbands, and this new husband is not her husband at all. Is he someone else's? What's the implication the way that they wrote that? Your current husband is know that woman. We know her name, wouldn't we? And yet, she doesn't have a name. The only name that she's given is the Samaritan woman, a Samaritan woman. So just from what we're told, we know three difficult things about her. Number one, she's a Samaritan, which is alone bad. Number two, we're told that the disciples are astonished that Jesus would be speaking to this woman. They're astonished because she's a woman, period. There's no clarification about why, just because she's a woman. And third, we know that something difficult has happened to her. We don't know her story. The text doesn't tell us. We do not know what happened. All we know is that we read into what we hear, and what we hear is that this woman has been married for 5 times and is now involved with a man who's not her husband. She could have been widowed 5 times. I mean, we don't know. But that's not really the first reading most people give this text. But had she been widowed, and that would be a compassionate reading, that is just unimaginable pain to endure. We don't know her story, but the parts that we do know tell us that something difficult happened. You know, Jesus encounters a whole lot of people with a whole lot of difficult stories, doesn't he? And not just in his ministry. Have you ever actually read the genealogy of Matthew? You know, all the begets and begottens now, we mostly flip through that stuff, right? I mean, have you ever looked at that? Are you aware that there are 5 women mentioned in the genealogy of Matthew? There's like 800 men, but there's 5 women. Do you know who they are? Do you know their names? Do you know their stories? Let me give you a little rundown. The first is Tamar in Genesis. Then there's Rahab from the book of Joshua. Then comes Ruth. We all know Ruth, the book of Ruth. Then there's the wife of Uriah. She goes unnamed. We'll get to her. And then, of course, Mary, Jesus' mother. Those are our 5 women. And we've talked about Mary before. She's a young woman, probably about 13. She's been contracted to marry an older, righteous man named Joseph, and she's kind of a nobody. And Joseph's from the line of King David, who suddenly discovers that she is pregnant and is now in danger of being cast aside by her family and her future husband, left with no security, because we know that unmarried women have no security, property, way to earn a living. Well, that's another interesting small town story. How would the story of Mary fly for a prophet? But what about the other 4? The first is Tamar. In Genesis, there's a man named Judah, and he has 3 sons. Judah is one of the 12 sons of Israel. Tamar is the first woman in the genealogy, and she's given to the oldest son of Judah in a marriage contract, and he dies. So by Hebrew law, Tamar is now given to the second son, and he dies. So Tamar has now lost 2 husbands. And we know that without a marriage, she won't have anything. So Judah does promise her to the last son, but then he doesn't live up to the contract. So I'm not going to get into the sordid details of this story. You can read it on your own. But let's just say that Tamar feels her only option is to resort to some extreme measures by posing as a, let's call her a woman for hire, if you will, in order for her to trick her father-in-law. And this results in 2 twin boys. One of the twin boys is Perez, and he's an ancestor of David. So here's a woman who loses 2 husbands back to back, and then gets threatened to be put aside like yesterday's garbage. so she has to fend for herself. I would say that's a difficult story. The second woman mentioned in the genealogy is Rahab, who lives in Jericho. Rahab's actually, by trade, one of these ladies for hire, as I mentioned. And she's so successful that she actually owns her own establishment, which is kind of unheard of. So she's independently wealthy. And we don't know what has happened to her that has led her up to her current trade. But what we do know is that Joshua and the Israelites are currently camped outside of town. They have put to the sword every single town in their wake, on their way to the promised land, and Jericho is in its way, and they're coming. And Rahab knows this. She also knows that her and her people are doomed. She states as much. So one night, Joshua's spies sneak into Jericho, and they spend the night at her place of business. And Rahab hides the spies on the roof in the morning, but she's ultimately trapping them. And she'll only show them how to escape if they promise to save her and her family. And when the spies return with Joshua and the army to sack the city, she and her family go unharmed because of this bargain. Here's another woman with a difficult story who takes desperate measures to protect her family. Rahab marries Salmon, a Hebrew. Their child together is Boaz, and he's the great-grandfather of King David. The third woman in Matthew's genealogy is, of course, Ruth. A lot of us know that story. Ruth is not a Hebrew. Her mother is Naomi. Her mother-in-law, is Naomi. She, with her husband, moved to Moab, and they had 2 sons, and one of the sons marries Ruth. But then Naomi's husbands and 2 sons die. Naomi and Ruth suffer great loss. Naomi wants to return to the land of Judah and tells her daughter-in-laws, "You're going to stay here, I got to go." And Ruth clings to her, saying, "Where you go, I go." Ruth is left with nothing and sees Naomi as her only family. And when they arrive in Judah, Ruth needs to secure a new marriage in Naomi's family in order to protect her future. So Naomi helps her. Ruth catches the eye of Boaz, who I mentioned before, Rahab's son. And Naomi basically tells her how to get him to marry her. Bible woman scholar Carol Newsom tells us in her Women's Bible Commentary that under Naomi's direction, Ruth puts Boaz in a basically compromising position on the threshing floor one night, and Boaz later agrees to marry her, allowing her a future. Ruth is yet another woman in the Bible who suffers great loss and makes some difficult choices. Ruth and Boaz have a child named Obed, who is the father of Jesse, and Jesse is the father of King David, which leads us to our fourth woman in the genealogy, the unnamed wife of Uriah. Did you get it yet? It's the famous temptress Bathsheba. We've all heard the story in 2 Samuel of how Bathsheba tempts King David off the course of the straight and narrow. But you know, there's actually nothing in the text that says that. I know! Gregory Peck and Citizen Hayward, but it's not in the Bible. All the text states is that David is walking about on the roof of the king's house, and he happens to see a beautiful woman bathing on the roof of his neighbor's home. And bathing on rooftops is not uncommon. He discovers the woman that he thinks is so beautiful is the wife of Uriah, his loyal member of the elite corps of the 30, and Uriah is presently off in battle. And I learned this in school too, but one of my colleagues, the Reverend Katie Cummings at Grace Presbyterian in Houston, has pointed out that the text only states, "Then David sends messengers to get her, and she came to him he lay with her. That's pretty difficult stuff. Pastor Katie explains that Bathsheba happens to be beautiful, yes. But when King David sends messages to get her, of course she would come willingly with them because her king has summoned her. And then we know what happens next. He sends messengers to get her. She comes with them. He lays with her. That doesn't sound like the wiles of a temptress to me. That sounds like violence being done against a woman. Violence being done at the hands of a king who thinks he can do whatever he wants. Do you know what happens next? King David sends her husband into battle with orders to be left at the front lines to die. The text then states, when Bathsheba hears that he's dead, she mourns in the King James Version. She laments in the NRSV. Lamenting means that she weeps and she wails because it's her husband whom she loves and he's dead. She suffers a great, great loss, not to mention violence. The text next states that when her mourning is over, David sent and brought her to his house. She became his wife and bore him a son. Period. There's no language in the text of her being some temptress or sinner or adulteress. There's no language in the text of her having a choice to say no to her king. She's yet another woman in the Bible with a very difficult story to tell. Bathsheba's son, King David, is Solomon, whose lineage leads to the birth of Joseph, Jesus' adopted father. These are the stories of the women who are named in the ancestry of Jesus Christ. They are women with difficult stories, difficult pasts, who face great loss, trauma, and violence. They're women who have had to make difficult choices. And Jesus is no stranger to difficult stories. It's no surprise to me that Jesus meets this Samaritan woman at this well and speaks to her when it's an astonishing thing to do so. It's not a surprise to me. It's not a surprising thing to me that he offers her living water so that she can go back to her people as a witness of God's great love and grace. It's no surprise to me that he would do such an astonishing thing. He gives her an identity. He calls her a woman. And all of us at one point or another, will face difficult times and have a difficult story to tell. We will face loss, hurt, guilt, really tough choices, loneliness, the judgment of others. And yet, in those moments of despair, when all we can do is try and get up and get out and go on the very best that we can, those moments when we cling to our own water jug and trudge the hot and lonely road to the well because maybe we just don't know what else to do. My friends, Christ will meet us there, offering us the living water of God's grace and love to quench our own thirst.